And you just wrote another really disturbing story highlighting how broken the system really is in D.C., that officials make it as hard as they can for law-abiding citizens to own a firearm, and then you have criminals who are released back to the street time and time again. Surprise, surprise, right?
That's right. I mean, it's just further evidence of how failed these liberal policies are of, we're going to have all this gun control and supposedly that's going to lower crime. And in the end, at least in D.C., violent crime is up 7% this year alone. And this is another case. This is a man named Ramad Spite. He is a psychotic, admitted psychotic by his public defender in his records that he's had 10 years of hearing voices. And Spite came out of his house, this was in March, in D.C., and started holding up a gun, screaming, and somebody called 911. A bunch of people called 911. Some officers, he's right on the border with Montgomery County, Maryland. Some Montgomery County officers came to the house, started walking up to the house where he was living with his mother, which obviously tells you something also about his ability to function in society. And when they got there, he yelled something like "game over" and started shooting at them. So the officers ran for cover and tried to disarm him without shooting, and he wouldn't stop. So they shot him 3 times, and that's the only thing that stopped him. But in the process, one of the officers was shot. So they took him to put him in jail after he got out of the hospital. Spade, he lived, and then he was in jail from March, and then just a few weeks ago, this judge named Florence Pan, who was put on the bench 3 years ago by President Obama in D.C. Superior Court, decided to let him go and put him on supposed house arrest. But even then, it's not even that strict. He's allowed to go to school. He's allowed to go to medical appointments. He's allowed to go to any kind of legal appointments. We are talking about somebody who's admitted to be a psychotic, who says he's hearing voices, and we think he's going to abide by these things, and not get another gun. And the reasoning from his lawyer, from the public defender, which is really quite unbelievable, is that because Spite was shot, and on his right arm, he can't use his right arm now, and so then he's safer because he can't use his right arm. So I guess he can only shoot his left arm.
I know. When I was reading that, this is his attorney, his public defender. He argues that, and then he also says, he's on new medication. So he's not going to be as dangerous as he used to be. Meanwhile, his poor neighbors and people in the neighborhood and people in the District of Columbia, in order to try to protect themselves against people like this, it's impossible for them to get a firearm.
That's right. I mean, and not even is it new antipsychotic medication that they're testifying he's on. He wasn't on any before. So this untreated psychotic has been on the loose. I mean, it's miraculous that nobody was killed in the shootout or hasn't been before. It's going to happen again. I mean, he's going to use his left arm. He's going to get a gun. And, he went after cops. Imagine if he's doing this when he's unarmed, if he thinks that he's hearing voices and thinks they've done something. And like you said, how are his neighbors supposed to protect themselves? They called 911 this time, and the police got there, obviously, in time before a civilian was hurt. But, are these neighbors expected to go to D.C. and legally spend $225 in fees to get guns and wait a 10-day waiting period, plus go down to the office 3 times and take a written test and pass a written test? And, all of this series of things that you have to do in D.C. to get a gun. Meanwhile, Spate's at his house right now with his mother, who goes to work, leaves him alone. He's hearing voices, is obviously violent. And it just goes to show you how the prioritizing in these liberal cities that put the interests of criminals ahead of the interests of the law-abiding. And, it was a conscious decision by the city council to prioritize releasing criminals, even these who use firearms, than it is to hold them. And it came up in a few years ago in city council, and now chairman of the city council, Phil Mendelson, had a hearing on this kind of thing on releasing criminals, and several of the police officers, including Chris Bowman, who I spoke with, testified and said, you got to put these guys under strict, you got to make it easier for judges to put these guys in jail and leave them in jail. This is ridiculous. And Phil Mendelson said, it's a matter of civil rights. We want to err on the side of their civil rights and letting them out, not err on the side of keeping them in.
And what about the right to protect yourself? It really is. And what about the right to protect yourself? And I think the head of the police union, he really summed it up. He said he called the system in D.C. a recipe for disaster. And as he pointed out, only in D.C. Can you shoot a police officer and be sent home to think about what you did instead of going to jail?
That's right. That's Chris Bowman, and he's the head of the union in D.C., so he's a very experienced officer. He was the one who testified in 2008 in this hearing and said, you've got to find a way to keep these guys behind jail. We can't keep facing, and that's probably, the D.C. police are not anti-gun. A lot of them are, but a lot of them, like Chris Bowman, is not, because he's like, that is the least part of our problem, are the law-abiding people. Or not the least, it's none of our problem. Law-abiding people with guns are not our problem. The criminals are our problem. Why are we spending any resources in enforcing these ridiculous laws to stop law-abiding people from having guns to protect themselves? That could be used for all these bad guys who have guns, keep going out, keep getting their guns illegally and using them, obviously, for crime. So, the police are infuriated because, one of their own has been shot. And this is both Maryland and D.C. at this point, because both are involved.
They're in the line of duty. They're put in jeopardy, as well as the law-abiding citizen who can't defend themselves.
And even in this, even if we want to be general, in this exact case, this Ramad Spite, as long as he's home, he is an active and real danger to society. And what cop now is going, when they get that 911 call from that neighbor, knows he's going to go facing somebody who's a psychotic. And got it done one time.
And Emily, it also highlights why it's so important people know who they're voting for. Because as you said, this is a judge that was appointed by President Obama to carry out his policies and his beliefs and his agendas.
That's right. I mean, I don't see how. Look, the Attorney General even said, you can't let this guy out. This is a D.C. Attorney General. You can't let this guy out. And this judge did it anyway. I don't see how any judge with any common sense can look at this person and say, okay, for the first time in his adult life, he's taking antipsychotic medications, and his right arm he can't currently use because he was shot. This is a good person to take out of jail. He's been in jail since March and needed to be. We're going to let him go.
Yeah. But, this story really should raise eyebrows, not only in D.C., but across the country when we're talking about a broken criminal justice system, because so many times we report these armed citizen stories, and time after time, the suspect was out on parole or they had a long criminal record. And it really should make people more, and I'm sure that's why we're seeing more and more people deciding, police do everything they can whenever they can, but they can't be everywhere all the time, and that's why I'm deciding to get a firearm.
That's right. And in D.C., that's not really a very plausible, for most people, it's a very underprivileged city. $250 in fees? That's an enormous amount of money. Not to mention you have to take a couple of days off work to do it, and there's a waiting period. So how would that help these neighbors who are suddenly living next door to an armed psychotic? The gun grabbers are so quick to jump all over guns, like in the situation in Colorado, when we don't know yet what his psychological issues are at homes, but it sure looks like he was probably psychotic. They're saying he was being treated for schizophrenia, which is the same thing as hearing voices and seeing things. These are the types of people, if we identify them, they need to be in hospitals or in jail if they're criminals, or in hospitals. They should not be out on the street. When this kind of thing happens, like this Spate case, you sure don't hear Bloomberg or Lautenberg or these guys jumping all over it. As they should, because this is the kind of situation that could make the society safer, which is putting people like this behind bars or in hospitals and not letting them out at all.